Alrighty, hey everyone. I hope all of you enjoyed your spring break. Just a couple of important things before we get started with lecture today. Number one, I'm so sorry I couldn't be here. I am actually in Lexington, Kentucky for the Tournament of Champions with speech and debate. And so I will be gone today for class. But I just want to let you know this lecture is recorded and it's going to go into Canvas on file. So you will have access to this recording. Okay, so no need to worry if you missed something or if I was going slightly too fast, you can relook at it for Canvas and in files. Okay. Second, for today in class, you will need your notebook. You will need your notebook and you will need the Chinese perception Team A, Team B, Team C, whichever you were on. It was a worksheet that was all about Chinese perceptions and where we looked at cartoons. So please take those two things out, your notebook and the Chinese perception cartoon worksheet. Okay. If you were absent before break began and you do not have your worksheet or you lost your worksheet, please go up to the teacher's desk. For the sub, there are some stacks, Team A, Team B, Team C for Chinese immigrant perceptions. Feel free to take and hand out whatever worksheet, does not matter which team is which. So just go ahead and hand those out. As we're getting those things out, folks, just a couple of reminders before we get started with lecture today. Number one, your week 15 homework is due on April 28th for evens. So evens, if you're watching this now, it was due yesterday. So please make sure you submitted that or reached out to me for an extension. For the odd periods, they are due on April 29th, so that would be tomorrow. Okay, so please make sure that you submit week 15 homework. Two, and second, if you still have not submitted your essay, please make sure that you submit that. At this point, I'm taking essays for 50% credit. You do not want that essay in as a 0. Please submit that ASAP. Third, your week 17 homework is now posted. Your week 17 homework is now posted. It is due on May 5th for the odd periods, May 5th for the odd, and May 6th for the even periods. That would be next Monday and Tuesday, respectively. There are 2 weeks of homework remaining, week 17 and week 18. Those are the last two homework assignments. So this is the last chance to get any of those points in your homework and participation category. So let's make sure you put your best foot forward. Last but not least, you will have one last in-class essay and quiz about Irish, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants on May 6th for the odd periods and May 7th for the evens. Again, you will have an in-class essay and quiz on May 6th for the odd periods and May 7th for the even periods, all about Irish, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants. I've already posted a study guide onto files. Click on files, then unit 2, and you should see that study guide there. I won't talk about it today in class, but I will talk about it more on Wednesday and Thursday. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk more about it on Wednesday and Thursday when I come back from Kentucky. Alrighty, with that said, let's jump right into lecture. Alrighty, the first thing that I want to go over before we jump into lectures, I just want to review. It's been a little while since we had our spring break, right? So I want us to review about what we talked about before we went on break. So the first thing I want us to do, I want you to turn to your elbow partner, and I want you to very briefly discuss two important questions. One, what jobs did Chinese immigrants work? What jobs did Chinese immigrants work? And second, how were the Chinese perceived or viewed in the United States? How were the Chinese viewed or perceived in the United States? Take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, just briefly discuss those two important questions. If you could just pause this video really quickly and let the students discuss for 30 seconds, that would be great. All righty. Hope you had a very fruitful discussion. As a reminder, right, for the Chinese, many of them worked in very sort of dangerous jobs, right? They were miners. where they were subject to poor conditions, right? They had to mine in very dangerous places. They were often using dynamite, and then people would not tell them when the dynamite would set off. And so many of the Chinese were trapped in rubble. They worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, right? They were railroad workers. And similarly, right, when they had to blast through mountains, they had to use dynamite. They had to scale, very high mountain cliffs and walls to sort of make way for the railroad, pave down and put down that track, right? So a lot of these jobs were super dangerous. The Chinese also worked laundromat jobs, right? That was huge. One of the big reasons for that, right, was the answer to that second question, right? How the Chinese were perceived. And for many of the Chinese, they were seen as job stealers by the Americans, right? Remember back to mining, right? The foreign miners tax was something that was specifically designated for those who were Chinese, right? Anyone who was not a citizen, had to pay $3 to be able to mine. And for the Chinese, they could never become citizens in the first place because they weren't white. And so as a result, we start to see the Chinese being discriminated via the foreign miners tax, right? They had to pay. They could not become citizens. They had to pay this fee in order to mine. And so a lot of the Americans begin to view the Chinese as job stealers, as people sort of coming in, taking jobs, right? And at the end of the day, right, leaving sort of these American workers in the dust. We see this, right? That answer that second question, like, Chinese people stealing jobs. When we take a look at the cartoons that we saw from before spring break, right? So again, this is our first cartoon that we saw, right? This, washing the magic washer, right? Uncle Sam kicking away the Chinese, right? Kicking them out of the United States. The Chinese must go, as you can see from the bottom of the screen here, the Chinese must go, right? Ironic again, given that the Chinese were pushed into these jobs by Americans, and yet the Chinese here were considered dirty, were disgusting, right? Yet they were the ones cleaning all the clothes in the first place. We also see this theme, right, of Chinese people sort of stealing jobs, right, with our second photo, right, our second cartoon. What shall we do with our boys, right? This Chinese sort of octopus man, right? This mutant figure with this, sort of rat-looking face, and this sort of queue, this long hairstyle. Um, of the Chinese person over here, right, stealing all these jobs, leaving these American men, right, these boys on the right, with no work, right? And as a result, many of the Americans began to hold a very, very deep resentment of the Chinese. Now, gentlemen, what I want to do now is I'm going to show you cartoon number four. So, cartoon number one, we sort of saw together. That was the Magic Washer. Cartoon number two was this cartoon, What Shall We Do with Our Boys? Cartoon number three is the cartoon that you did with your elbow partner in teams, right? I'm going to show you cartoon number four. Okay. Cartoon number four is called The Coming Man, right? The Coming Man. What is he coming to do, right? What I want you to do is I want you to take your Chinese perceptions worksheet, And what I want you to do is I want you to turn to that third page. Okay. It should be cartoon number four, The Coming Man. Okay. And what you're going to do is just like cartoons number one, two, and three, you're going to work this time individually. You're going to work individually to paraphrase. Tell me what's going on in the cartoon that's going to pop up on a screen in a second. And also, I want you to write down what is the argument? What is the argument the cartoonist is trying to make here? What is the argument the cartoonist is trying to make? So you're going to do and answer those two questions individually. Don't go to the thesis just yet. Okay, don't go to the thesis or the analysis just yet. Just focus on the cartoon number four. Alrighty, folks, this is cartoon number four. It says The Coming Man. Let me read you some of the captions. So the caption at the bottom reads The Coming Man, all same Melican Man monopoly. Okay, which translates to in broken English, right? All same American man monopoly. The hand, right, says monopoly, right? And these goods are as follows. We have some things called laundry, right? We have shirt manufacturing, underwear manufacturing, right? Cuban cigars. We have boxes, box factories, right? Clothing factories. So, gentlemen, what I want you to do again, take about 3.5 minutes, work individually, write down a paraphrase, right? What is this cartoon sort of showing? And second, what is the argument the cartoonist is trying to make? What is the argument here, right? Paraphrase that, write that argument down. So if you could give them about 3.5 minutes um, to go ahead and write down, go ahead and pause this video for about 3.5 minutes. Alrighty, folks. So let's go over this cartoon together, right? So as you can see, there are some big, big details here that are super important to the sort of argument the cartoonist is trying to make, right? So first of all, we have this huge, huge Chinese person right over here, right? You can see that his teeth are sort of bucktooth shaped, right? You can see his long sort of rat sort of tail or queue, right? On the back of his head, right? Again, comparing the Chinese to animals like rats, right? Dehumanizing them. We also see, right, his fingers, just like the fingers of a Chinese in the magic washer, right? Long, right? Pointed, right? Again, non-human, right? Now, this Chinese person is again overshadowing, right? Overshadowing these figures in the back. What we can presume to be white Americans, Anglo-Americans, who are, raising their fists. They're furious, right, at this Chinese person, right, in front of them that's, really tall, overshadowing them, right? Now, as many of you know, right, playing the game Monopoly, right, the game Monopoly, you want to amass as much property as possible. You want total control over something, right? Well, in this particular photo, in this particular cartoon, what do the Chinese want total control over? Well, they want total control over all of these jobs: laundry, shirt manufacturing, Cuban cigar making, box factories, clothing factories, doesn't matter. The Chinese are here, right, to take control of all of this work, leaving the Americans with nothing, right? Not a single job. The Chinese are here to steal our jobs, right? Where have we heard that line before? Right. And as you can see as well, right, the Chinese, you can see the Chinese person is standing right in front of the factories where many of these workers would be, in and working in, right? So, the Chinese, again, just like the Irish, right? When we studied the Irish immigrants, the Chinese were hired as scabs, right, to replace these workers, right? The Chinese were viewed as rats, as people that were sort of invading this country in order to take and steal American jobs. Now, folks, what I want us to do now is I want us to continue on in our paraphrasing worksheet. So the paraphrase worksheet now asks you to write a thesis statement. Okay, the paraphrase worksheet now asks you to write a specific thesis statement. So what I want you to do is I want you to read that question out loud, right? Or to yourself, right? Whatever you want to do. And I want you to write down a thesis statement that answers that question. Remember, your thesis statement has to answer two questions, right? It has to answer both why and it has to answer how, right? So why and how, right? It has to answer those two specific questions. Okay. Remember, your question is, right, why and how, right, or why were the Chinese immigrants perceived so negatively in the United States, right? How and why were Chinese immigrants perceived so negatively in the United States? Go ahead and take about 7 minutes. I want you to break this down in this format. I want you to spend about 2.5-ish minutes writing your thesis statement. And then I want you to spend about 4.5 minutes writing your analysis. On the back page, the very back, page 4, there is a box. Write your analysis in that box. You don't have to reiterate all parts of the cartoon that you would like to use, right? But what I want you to do is I want you to choose one cartoon, any one cartoon that you remembered, any one cartoon that you've seen before, and I want you to write down how that cartoon proves your thesis statement. Now, what would be super important is referencing details in that cartoon, right? What parts of that cartoon specifically prove this thesis statement? This is going to be super important for your in-class essay because one of the things that you will see in your in-class essay is I'm going to provide you pieces of evidence. You need to interpret and paraphrase it, and you need to analyze it, right? And you can analyze it by providing specific details and explaining how it supports the how and why of your thesis. Now, gentlemen, I've also provided you some important analysis starters. You can feel free to use them. You don't have to, right? But please make sure that you write your thesis statement and then move on to your analysis. Choose any one cartoon that you've seen and explain how that one cartoon proves your thesis. Okay. Sub, if you could just pause here for about 7 minutes. You have 7 minutes to work, students. Write your thesis, move on to your analysis. Go ahead. Alrighty, folks. Hopefully you had some time to write down your thesis and write down some analysis. Again, this is going to be a super important skill when we come to that in-class essay that will be happening next week. Again, I'll talk a bit more about that on Wednesday and Thursday when I get back from Kentucky. At this point, we're going to transition to our notebooks. We're not going to turn in the Chinese immigrants and perception sheet yet, so please keep that with you. Do not turn in the worksheet at the end of class. Keep the worksheet with you. We will turn that in at the end of next class. Okay, so keep the worksheet. Let's transition to your notebooks, right? So if you could take 10 seconds, transition really quickly. Alrighty, transitioning in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit. We're going to transition into moving out of cartoons and sort of de facto discrimination. And we're going to talk a little bit about de jure discrimination, right? De jure, as you all know, means by law, right? How have Chinese immigrants been legally discriminated? We saw how society perceived them, right? We saw how the Chinese were viewed as rats, as people stealing jobs, as sort of vile vermin, right? Well, how are they legally being treated, right? Let's take a look at some specific laws and some legal cases, right? Now, the first case that I want to talk briefly about is People versus Hall. People versus Hall. Let me lay down the facts of this case for you. So, what ends up happening is a man, a white Anglo-Saxon man, right, an American man, George W. Hall, right, who is white, and two other sort of white Americans, Anglo-Americans, they end up going out into these sort of raids like this on the right here. You can see, some Anglo-Americans sort of terrorizing Chinese people. This is in a Chinatown. You can see some Chinese characters here lining the sides of the houses. And you can see that these individuals, they're terrorizing this community, right? They're throwing bricks and pans, right? They're tossing tables out of windows. This guy right here is pulling on this Chinese person's queue, right? They're sort of breaking into homes, right? And so these are sort of violent attacks, sort of very similar to pogroms, right, against the Jewish immigrants. Chinese immigrants were also targeted, right, with a lot of hate crimes. They were, their homes were ransacked. They were attacked, right? Now, here's what ends up happening in this case, right? So George W. Hall ends up going out into one of these raids, and he and his two American buddies end up killing a Chinese man named Ling Sing. So this Chinese man dies as a result. Now, a judge, right? He is, George is arrested. He is taken to court. A judge is hearing this case. And as the judge is hearing this case, the prosecution, right, who wants Hall to be punished, right, for his crimes, pulls up Chinese witnesses. And Chinese witnesses take the stand. And the Chinese witnesses are describing, hey, this is what happened. This is what Hall did. This is what he did to our community. He ends up killing one of our family members, one of our neighbors, Ling Sing, right? He needs to be put in jail. And the judge agrees. The judge decides actually to execute George W. Hall. He is going to be hanged from the neck until dead. But George Hall says, "Nuh-uh, I'm not having that sentence. I'm going to appeal it to the California Supreme Court. I'm going to appeal this sentence to the California Supreme Court." I want you to take 30 seconds. What do you think and how do you think the Supreme Court rules on this case? How do you think this California Supreme Court rules on this case? Gentlemen, take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, very quickly discuss. Sub, if you just pause this for 30 seconds while the students are discussing. Alrighty, again, I hope you had a good discussion. If you said that the California Supreme Court overturns that sentence, you'd be exactly right. So the California Supreme Court takes a look at this case and is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. The judge let Chinese witnesses on the stand? Uh-uh. That's actually no good, right? We need to throw out this sentence because Chinese witnesses cannot testify in cases against those who are white. And so the California Supreme Court begins to set a precedent, a rule, right? Where if someone who needs to be charged with a crime is white, if there are Chinese witnesses who can testify against him, they're not allowed to testify. So if you're Chinese and someone commits, a hate crime against you, and you want to bring him to court, you can't be the person testifying in court about what that Anglo-American did, right? So the California Supreme Court, at the end of the day, rules that Chinese witnesses can't testify against those who are white. And they have this very bizarre, sort of very wonky logical reasoning here. The logical reasoning they use is as follows. They take a look at the California Constitution. And in the Constitution, it says that, when the words sort of like black or Indian or mulatto show up, those words don't just refer to those who are black or Indian or mulatto, right? They actually refer to any person of color. So, for example, if it says, those who are Native American cannot own property, they're not just referring to Native Americans, they're referring to anyone who isn't white. And so they take this very sort of screwed up logic and they apply it to this case and they say, hey, we already don't allow those who are black to testify against those who are white. We already don't allow those who are Native American to testify against those who are white. So too the Chinese, because when the Constitution uses the words white or black or Native American or mulatto, they're not just referring to those racial groups. They're referring to anyone who isn't white. But that's not the only case in which we see discrimination against the Chinese. We start to see discrimination in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, gentlemen, what I want us to do is we're going to watch this video. And as we're watching this video, I want you to answer the first question. Just the first question. Don't worry about the second. I just want you to answer the first question in your notebook. Why was the Chinese Exclusion Act passed? Right? Why was the Chinese Exclusion Act passed? Let's take a listen. This video does go a little fast, right? So just focus on that question. Why was the Chinese Exclusion Act passed? Let's take a listen.
What was the Chinese Exclusion Act? The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first major federal law to block immigration on the basis of race alone. It not only banned Chinese laborers from entering the country, but also made it extremely difficult for Chinese residents to re-enter the United States after traveling abroad. Since the early 1800s, thousands of Chinese immigrants had moved here to work as laborers in gold mines and other infrastructure projects. Their efforts contributed greatly to U.S. expansion, but left some Americans struggling to find work. The public response was to lay the blame on an entire ethnic group. White activists lobbied the government for change. In 1882, President Chester A. Arthur buckled to the pressure and signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many people campaigned against it, but even when the act expired 10 years later, Congress voted to extend it. Finally repealed in 1943, it set a precedent for complex immigration policies that continue to have an impact today.
So again, that was super fast, but let's slow down. Let's break this down. First, take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, and just very briefly discuss. Why was the Chinese Exclusion Act passed? Sub, if you could just pause this for 30 seconds as the students discuss. Again, remember back to our conversation about Chinese people stealing jobs, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act, at the end of the day, was really passed in order to stop Chinese laborers, Chinese workers from coming over because we were fearful. Americans were fearful that the Chinese would be taking all of their jobs, right? And as a result, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, which really remains in place until like 1943, we see a significant decrease in the number of Chinese immigrants being allowed to come into the United States in the first place. Now, I want to go back to the Supreme Court just for a second. I want to talk a little bit about another Supreme Court case, Yickwo versus Hopkins. Now, remember, one of the jobs that the Chinese would be working in these laundromats, right? They would be working in these laundromats. And I want to talk actually a little bit about a case in which the Chinese were successful, in which the Chinese managed to win and get the Supreme Court on their side. Now, for homework, you talked a little bit about Wong Kim Ark, right? Wong Kim Ark was a American citizen who was born in the United States, but travels back to China, and as he comes back, right, they don't let him in the country. And the reason why they don't let him in is because he's Chinese, right? That would violate the Chinese Exclusion Act. At the end of the day, Wong Kim Ark appeals his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And he's one of the big reasons why we have the rule. We have the rule today where if you are born in the United States, you are automatically a US citizen, right? If you were born here on US soil, you are automatically a US citizen, right? The Supreme Court sides with Wong Kim Ark and says that, hey, if you were born right in the US, you are automatically a US citizen, right? So that's one of the successes. Another big one of these successes is Yickwo versus Hopkins. Now, gentlemen, I want to remind you, there aren't a lot of words on this slide, but I want you to focus on the words that I'm saying, and I want you to write down some notes with what I'm talking, right? And facts about the case, okay, in addition to what is on the slide here. Right, so let me lay down the facts of a case for you in Yickwo versus Hopkins. So in the 1800s, as we start to see, right, more and more Chinese people come over to the United States, we start to see them working in laundromats, right? They are forced out of these American jobs, right? Factory jobs, railroad jobs, mining jobs, and they're forced to find work elsewhere. And so for many Chinese men, they start to make a business out of laundry, right? You can see an American woman here, right? Putting a coin in this Chinese person's hand for the clothes that he just washed, right? Now, here's what ends up happening. In San Francisco, the San Francisco sort of board of supervisors, they pass a law, they pass a city ordinance that says if you want a laundromat, if you want to operate a laundromat, you have to have a permit. You have to have a permit. If you do not have a permit, you cannot operate. And this rule was racially neutral. It did not matter what race you were. You needed to have a permit in order to be able to operate a laundromat. So these city workers go and start enforcing this city ordinance. Now, about 89% of the laundromats in San Francisco were actually owned by the Chinese, right? 89%, only about 11% were owned by other people of color, right? Or other individuals, other races, right? But 89% of laundromats were owned by the Chinese. The only problem? None, zero, zip, nada, no laundromat that was owned by the Chinese ended up getting a permit, right? Even when they applied, right? Even when they asked specifically for one, no Chinese laundromat owner got a permit. White laundromat owners got a permit, but not the Chinese ones. And so this man, Yickwo, right over here, right, ends up suing the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and is like, hey, it is not fair that I don't get laundromat permits, but those who are white did, right? This law is being unequally applied. And this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Yickwo is successful. The Supreme Court sides with Yickwo and says, hey, even though the law is racially neutral, right? Even though at the end of the day, the law applies to everyone, it doesn't matter what race you were, you had to have a laundromat permit in order to operate. The problem was that the law was not being equally applied, right? The law was not being equally applied. No one was equally protected under the law, right? So the Supreme Court says, hey, this violates the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, right, in addition to birthright citizenship, also offers equal protection under the law, under the Equal Protection Clause, right? And Yickwo isn't being equally protected under the law here, right? The Supreme Court said, hey, you can't discriminate against those who are Chinese by specifically denying them those laundromat permits, right? If everyone's equally protected under the law, then we also need to give and equally, hand out permits to those who are Chinese. And so at the end of the day, this is an example of some success that we see in the Chinese community. Yes, we can finally sort of fight back, right? Now, I want to take a second and talk about another law, a specific law that applies to Chinese women. Now, I want you to take 30 seconds and I want you to turn to your elbow partners and just very briefly discuss, right? There was a little section in the Takaki that talked a little bit about Chinese women and how they were sort of seen or viewed in the United States. Gentlemen, take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, discuss very briefly how were Chinese women treated in the United States? How were Chinese women treated in the United States? Sub, if you just take 30 seconds and pause this video as the students are discussing. I hope all of you had a very fruitful discussion. I want to reiterate a very common perception of Chinese women. Many Chinese women were actually seen or viewed as prostitutes. They were viewed as dirty. They were viewed as people who were selling their bodies to try and make some money off the side. Now, during this time, many of the Chinese did not come, or Chinese women did not come over to the United States. There were very few places for them. It was very difficult to have families here. Many of the men were either mining or doing railroad work, right, in factories, in laundromats, doing jobs that, women, either in the first three cases would probably not be doing because they needed to be at home to take care of the children. Or in the last case, right, if the Chinese men were doing laundry themselves, Chinese women didn't have to, right? So in this particular case, we start to see Chinese women, right, not really coming over to the United States. Many of them stayed back home in China and took care of children like this over on the right-hand side of the screen here, right? Now, for those who end up coming over to the United States, it was a very harsh life. Again, many of them had to sell their bodies. They were prostitutes. They were exploited, especially when they were prostitutes. Many of them, ended up dying from STDs or sexually transmitted diseases. Many prostitutes were killed by the people that they were sleeping with. Many of them committed suicide. Many of them became opium addicts, right? And many of them were even forced to go into sort of prostitution in order to pay back that ticket via the credit ticket system. So this was not a very good place for Chinese women. Now, for many Chinese women, again, like I said, they were seen as dirty, right, because they were prostitutes. And so the United States passes the Page Law of 1875, otherwise also known as the Page Act. So the Page Law, Page Act, either one okay. The Page Law, Page Act of 1875 prohibited the immigration of women, right, Chinese women in particular, to stop prostitution. So again, Chinese people viewed as dirty, right? And so the Page Law comes in, bans Chinese women in order to stop more prostitutes from coming over to the United States. Now, all of this, right, again, is this culmination from this fear that Chinese people are coming over, they're stealing jobs, right? But here's the thing, that wasn't really actually true, right? And we also begin to see a huge shift when we get to the 1900s. In the 1900s, there's a huge event. There's a huge event that ends up happening in 1906, right? There's a huge event that happens in 1906. What happens, right? We see the big earthquake in San Francisco, right? The 1906 earthquake is huge. It rattles citizens all across San Francisco, right? It really shakes up, no pun intended, everything in San Francisco, and in addition, causes a huge fire. The shake actually wasn't the biggest problem. There were actually, leaking gas mains that ended up sort of igniting a huge fire in San Francisco, and it destroyed a lot of the buildings in the city, including one of the big buildings where we held records for citizens, right? Now, what ended up happening here, what ended up happening is we end up getting more and more Chinese immigrants to come over. There is a huge loophole that gets developed after these records of citizenship become destroyed. What's that loophole? Well, many of the Chinese immigrants, because their documents get destroyed in the fire, many of them claim to be born in the United States. After all, under Wong Kim Ark versus US, if you were born in the United States, you were an automatic US citizen. And so many of the Chinese said, hey, you know I look Chinese, but I'm actually born here, right? And under Wong Kim Ark, that makes me a US citizen. And because they are a US citizen, right, they want to use that power to bring over more of their family members. And so we start to see this little loophole, right, develop. Chinese people begin to sort of use and wield their power, right? Let's claim to be US citizens. Let's bring over more people, right? Let's have, kids in the United States, right? Let's establish ourselves here in this country. And so the US quickly sort of latches on. They sort of, realize, oh my gosh, the Chinese are totally exploiting, right, the fact that this building burned down in this big earthquake and are totally just claiming to be citizens. And so as a result, what ends up happening is the United States in 1910 establishes an immigration station. Now, we learned about for Irish and Jewish immigrants an immigration station on the East Coast, Ellis Island. In Ellis Island, many immigrants were accepted. They were, stamped, moved on, stamped, moved on. People were let in. Angel Island, on the other hand, served a different purpose. We're going to watch this quick little video, and we're going to split it up into two parts. In the first part, I want you to write down in your notebook, what is the purpose of Angel Island? Again, what is the purpose of Angel Island? What is the purpose of Angel Island? Let's take a listen to this video.
Just off Point Tiburon in the San Francisco Bay, there's an old barracks full of dark stories.
1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows.
They're stories of ill treatment and unnecessary incarceration.
Hoping to step ashore the American continent is the most difficult of difficulties.
The words aren't written on paper, but carved on the wooden walls, only to be painted over many times.
The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance.
The stories are those of men, women, and children waiting to leave the Angel Island immigration station.
It was not a welcoming place. There's no Statue of Liberty to welcome immigrants here. This was a place built to exclude.
Today, Angel Island is managed by the California State Parks, but from 1910 to 1940, the federal government detained thousands of immigrants here. Built because of its isolation, the detention center carried out new immigration rules and checked for diseases. But park interpreter Casey Dexter Lee says the park's main purpose was to enforce a very specific law.
Their job here was to enforce the Chinese exclusion laws. This place was built with that in mind.
Since the start of the California gold rush, anti-Asian sentiment had been on the rise. In an effort to curb the influx of Chinese immigrants, President Chester Arthur signed into law the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which suspended Chinese immigration.
Here, the idea was to detain people to figure out a way to send them back.
While they were at the detention center, Chinese immigrants went through harsh interrogation and demeaning physical exams. Oftentimes, they'd be living in deplorable conditions, and families would be separated and forced to sleep in cramped communal quarters.
Our second half of this video, I want you to write down in your notebook, what did the Chinese immigrants who came to Angel Island have to endure? What did the Chinese immigrants who arrived in Angel Island have to endure, go through? Again, what did Chinese immigrants who arrived on Angel Island have to go through? Let's continue with the video.
What we see represented in this room with Angel Island is similar to what's happening today on the southern border in terms of how we have children locked in detention.
Edward Tepburn is with the Angel Island. Island Immigration Station Foundation, which has been helping to preserve the Chinese immigrants' stories and remind visitors about the island's dark past.
These poems were carved by Chinese detainees during the days, weeks, months, and in some cases years that they were held here on Angel Island.
Because of its isolation, few outsiders could see what it was like inside the barracks, but the more than 200 poems carved into the walls offer a glimpse into the past.
In some cases, they represent despair, desperation, anger, frustration.
Today, many of those poems are painted over. The immigration station closed in 1940 and turned into a military training facility. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. Then, following the end of World War II, Angel Island was basically abandoned.
But it's because of these poems that the buildings still stand today.
Very few people who were detained here are still alive to tell their immigration story. But thanks to these poems, the building was ultimately recognized as a National Historic Landmark and preserved for everyone to see.
And our hope is that by coming here, they connect with the history, they connect with the stories and the emotions, and that sparks people to have conversations with their family members.
From the Angel Island Immigration Station, I'm John Bartell. Hope to see you on the back road.
So again, the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, was really enforced with Angel Island, this immigration station on the west coast in San Francisco Bay, right, which sought to exclude, to sort of ensure that the Chinese would not ever leave and get to California, but instead would stay on this island forever. There are many Chinese people who have died on this island and never got to set foot on the San Francisco sort of shore, right? Never got into the United States in the first place. They were just stuck there and could not go back. Angel Island, if you want to visit, is still visible now by ferry. So if you want to take a ferry over to Angel Island, I would strongly recommend it. The poems are still there on the wall. I was able to go when I was a kid, and hopefully I'll have some time over the summer to go back since it is such a powerful place. But would strongly recommend if you have time, head on up to Angel Island, take a look at some of what's going on. Now, gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about one last method of immigration, right? Now, we talked a little bit about how after destruction of citizenship, those documents, we see a loophole. Well, there was another loophole. And that loophole, gentlemen, was called paper sons and paper merchants. So I want to take a second and talk a little bit about these paper sons. Now, to get into the United States, another method to get in the United States after Angel Island was established was that many people would actually be, fake being U.S. merchants. One of the things that the Chinese, or one of the individuals, the Chinese Exclusion Act gave an exemption to, right, allowed people to come in. One of the groups of people that could come into the United States were business people, merchants that could conduct business in the U.S. Who were Chinese and then just go back home, right? So merchants, Chinese merchants who would just go to the city, sell what they needed to sell, buy what they needed to buy, and then leave, right? That was one way to get in, right? Was to fake actually being a merchant. So people would sort of come up with these sort of fake pseudonyms, right? These different names, different, appearances. They would fake being U.S. merchants. And in addition, some of the sons of Chinese people wanting to come over for jobs would pretend to be sons of these paper merchants. And they were called paper sons. Why? Because they passed as legal on paper. So this is an example of a paper son right over here on the right. We have his name, right? Choi Ging-fun, right? Up here, right? We have his age. He is 14. He is a student, and he was submitted. He says he's a son of merchant, right? He's a paper son, right? And what many people would do, actually, is many people would come up with a totally different persona. So this is not actually Choi's real name. Choi goes by something else. I don't know what it is, but his sort of merchant, his son of a merchant, his paper son name is Choi Ging-fun. And what he would do is Choi, as he was sailing over to the United States, would be preparing for one big task. They would be preparing for interrogations. Why? Because many of the Chinese people who came in and claimed to be paper merchants or paper sons would get tested. the Americans caught on really quickly and said, well, not all of these people are merchants, so we need to weed some folks out. And what the Americans would do is they would subject the Chinese to very harsh interrogations, very specific interrogations, right? We needed a method. Americans needed a method to check whether or not paper sons were actually paper sons. And so what they would do is they would sit folks down and they would ask them very, very specific and pointed questions. Like, how many windows are there in your house? And if you didn't know, right, they get a little suspicious, right? The Takaki text even mentions where two twins, right, the two twin boys were interrogated together and they were interrogated in two separate rooms. And the question was, hey, do you have a pet at home? And one of them answered, yes, we do. The other answered no, right? And the next day, the person who answered yes was like, was brought into another room, and the interrogator goes, hey, like your twin said no, you didn't have a pet. Why did you say yes? And the twin very quickly sort of had to think of an excuse, and he goes, oh, well, we did have a pet, but now we don't because we were so hungry in China that we ended up eating our dog, right? Talk about stereotypes, right? So this was this intense sense of interrogation that these paper sons and paper merchants would have to go through. And in order for you to study, to make sure you pass the interrogation, you had to study. And so what they would do is they would buy a booklet of all the information, all the facts of your chosen household, your paper household. And you would have to spend all the time memorizing all these little details in order for you to pass the interrogation. So this was not an easy way to get in, but this is certainly one way. And many people actually were able to get into the United States by claiming to be paper sons or even paper daughters, right, of merchants over here. Now, the last topic I want to talk very briefly about today is I want to talk a little bit about community. Now, gentlemen, take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, very briefly discuss how did Chinese immigrants create communities in the US? And to sort of help you brainstorm, right, I want you to focus on three terms: Tongs, Fongs, and Chinatowns. Take 30 seconds, turn to your elbow partner, very briefly talk a little bit about how Chinese immigrants created community using Tongs, Fongs, and Chinatowns in the United States. Sub, if you could just pause this video. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about Chinatowns, Tongs, and Fongs. So I want to start off with the the easiest one that we all know, right? Chinatowns. What are they? Well, they're ethnic enclaves, right? An enclave is sort of like a safe sort of space that people can sort of be around, a place that sort of feels like home, a safe place for them, right? And for the Chinese, Chinatowns were that safe space, right? This was a place where people could buy Chinese goods, where people were selling Chinese goods. This was a place as well that catered to the Chinese community, right? There were activities here. People could go celebrate Chinese New Year, right? People could gamble and play mahjong here, right? They could speak their native language. As you know, there is a Chinatown in San Francisco. I think many of you have gone there, right? There's also a Chinatown in Oakland. It's a little smaller, and there is actually a Chinatown in San Jose. It's near Happy Hollow Zoo, actually. No longer active, but you can still see parts and remnants of Chinese buildings there, right? Now, what about tongs? What are tongs? Well, tongs are organizations that served as gathering places for secret societies and sworn brotherhoods. The big thing that you need to know about tongs here is that they're really associated with gangs. They provided protection. This is super important. They provided protection for Chinese immigrants, right? So if someone was being harassed by Anglo Americans, the tongs would provide them protection in exchange for you joining their secret society or their gang, right? So Tongs offered friendship, offered connections, offered protection for many of these immigrants. And many of these Tongs are associated with gangs. So those are the two big things you have to remember, right? Organizations, secret, gangs, and correlated with protection, right? They protected people and Chinese immigrants from Anglo Americans. The last important organization I would like to talk a little bit about are Fongs and Huiguans, right? These are organizations similar to Tongs, except the Fongs, starting with an F, or a Huiguan, The Fangs and Huiguans are actually organizations that focus much more on society, right? Social benefits, social welfare. So Fangs and Huiguans are organizations comprised of family and village members. They are very, very big with social connections. An example of one are the Chinese six companies, or the 中华会馆, and this sort of organization, the Chinese six companies, are super important because they actually provided health and education services. So, if you were sick, right, if you broke your foot, right, they would take you to a doctor. They would pay for that doctor's visit. They would pay to help you out. They provided benefits. They provided social and educational opportunities for immigrants. They brought them to school, right? They paid for their tuition, right? They allowed these, kids of Chinese immigrants to learn in this country. The other big thing that's super important about the Chinese six companies is they actually had alliances with white business communities in the United States. And so many of them were able to actually form alliances. They were able to sort of build community with these other white business owners. And it was very, very important to do so that Chinese people could get a foot through the door, right? That, even though it was sort of looked down or frowned down on at the time, that even white business owners could potentially hire some Chinese workers, not a lot, but maybe a few of them, to work in their jobs, right? And so the Chinese six companies, this group right down here on the lower right here, right, provided those opportunities for Chinese immigrants. Gentlemen, that is where we'll stop today. Again, this video will be posted onto files for Canvas for you, so you can take a look if you're missing anything. I hope you have a good rest of your Monday or Tuesday. I will see you on Wednesday and Thursday, and we will talk a little bit about our our in-class essay and our quiz then. I hope you have a great rest of your day. That concludes lecture.